The narrow streets stretched out before Lily like endless ribbons of shadow. Her worn-out shoes scraped against the cracked pavement, each step echoing into the empty night. The dim glow of a flickering street lamp cast her slender frame in fleeting light. She'd hugged her patched jacket close, shielding herself from the chill. Exhaustion tugged at her every movement. Today had been no different from the countless others spent scrubbing floors and chasing wages to keep her family afloat. As she rounded the corner near the old, graffiti-covered building, a strange sight stopped her in her tracks. There, half hidden by the shadows of a narrow alley, lay a man. His disheveled clothes were torn, his face pale under the faint glow of the moon. For a moment, Lily froze, her heartbeat quickening as fear whispered caution in her ear. What if it's a trap? She muttered under her breath, clutching the strap of her threadbare bag tightly. Her eyes darted around the deserted street. But there was no movement, no sound apart from the distant bark of a dog. She took a hesitant step closer. The man remained motionless. Swallowing her fear, Lily knelt beside him. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. Dirt and dried blood streaked his face, and his hands, callous yet oddly refined, trembled faintly in the cold. "Are you okay?" she whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. No response. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to avoid whatever trouble might follow this man. But her gaze lingered on the desperation etched into his unconscious face. A pang of guilt knotted her stomach. How could she turn away when he clearly needed help? Her thoughts churned, weighing the risks. What if someone comes looking for him? What if they come for me too? She whispered to herself. Yet, as she stared down at him, the question that tugged at her heart was louder. What if I don't help him, and he doesn't survive? With a deep breath, she made her choice. "All right," she murmured, her voice firm despite the fear coursing through her veins. She grasped his arm and struggled to lift him. He was heavier than she'd imagined, and every step toward her tiny apartment felt like moving a mountain. Her breaths came in sharp gasps, but she refused to give up. Finally, she reached her one-room dwelling. With a grunt, she eased him onto the worn-out mattress in the corner. The dim light of a single bulb illuminated his battered face, revealing scars and bruises that told a story of violence and hardship. As Lily fetched a bowl of water and an old cloth, doubt crept in. Who was this man? What kind of trouble had he been running from? She glanced at her mother and siblings, asleep behind the thin curtain that divided the room. Had she made a mistake bringing him here? She dampened the cloth and began cleaning his wounds with care. His face twitched slightly at her touch, but his eyes remained closed. "I hope I'm doing the right thing," she whispered, more to herself than to him. The stranger stirred briefly, his lips moving in an inaudible murmur. She leaned closer, catching fragmented words. "They'll find me, not safe." His voice, hoarse and broken, sent a shiver down her spine. Danger clung to his words like a shadow that refused to fade. Despite the growing unease in her chest, Lily found herself softening. She had made a choice to see the humanity in someone who the world might have abandoned. As the man drifted back into unconsciousness, Lily sat down on the creaky wooden floor, her knees hugged tightly to her chest. Her thoughts wandered to her siblings and the lessons she had tried to instill in them. "Be kind, even when the world isn't kind to you," she had always said. Now, those words felt heavier than ever. The room was silent except for the stranger's shallow breathing. Lily rested her head against the wall, her heart torn between fear and an unshakable sense of compassion. She had no idea what lay ahead, who this man truly was or what trouble he might bring. But for now, she held on to the hope that her small act of kindness could make a difference. The morning sunlight seeped weakly through the cracks in the wooden window frame, casting uneven patterns across the small, cluttered room. Lily stood in front of the stove, stirring a pot of thin porridge with practiced hands. The aroma was faint, barely enough to fill the room, but it would have to suffice. Behind her, the soft murmur of her younger siblings waking up mingled with the low coughs of her ailing mother. "Lily," her mother's voice was barely above a whisper, "did you sleep at all last night?" Lily glanced over her shoulder and forced a smile. "I'll rest later, Mama. Don't worry about me." She quickly turned back to the stove, blinking back the weariness threatening to spill from her eyes. Rest wasn't something she could afford, not when the landlord was already knocking about the overdue rent and her siblings needed school books they couldn't buy. The neighborhood outside their small house told a story of its own. Crumbling buildings, cracked roads, and faded paint hinted at dreams long forgotten. Lily often wondered if people here had stopped believing in change. For as long as she could remember, she had been the one holding her family together. It wasn't easy, but someone had to. As she walked to her second job later that day, the weight of her reality pressed heavily on her chest. Her dreams of finishing school and escaping this life felt farther away with each passing year. She had always imagined herself in a classroom, surrounded by books, learning about the world beyond these broken streets. But dreams, she realized, didn't fill empty stomachs or keep the cold out. Stopping at the corner store to collect a small packet of rice, Lily overheard the cashier chatting with a customer. "Did you hear about the girl from the other side of town? Got a scholarship, going to college now." Lily paused, clutching the rice tighter. A pain of jealousy, sharp and bitter, coursed through her. Not because she begrudged someone else's success, but because she knew it would never be her story. Still deep down, there was a flicker of hope she couldn't extinguish. Maybe one day, she whispered to herself, though the words sounded hollow. Despite the bleakness of her life, there was something unbreakable about Lily. She was kind, even when life had been anything but kind to her. She gave freely, even when she had little to give. It was a quality her mother often praised. Lily, her mother had once said, "The world is full of darkness. People will try to take your light, but never let them succeed. You don't know how much that light can mean to someone else." Those words stayed with her, guiding her through the hardest days. It was why she stopped to help stray animals, even if it meant sharing her small portion of food. It was why she never turned away from someone in need, even when her heart carried the weight of 1,000 struggles. The stranger stirred on the old mattress, his face twisted in confusion as his eyes fluttered open. Lily watched from across the room, a mix of caution and curiosity swirling within her. His clothes, though dirty and torn, were once expensive. His hands, though calloused, carried an air of refinement. "Where?" His voice was hoarse, his words barely audible. "You're safe," Lily said softly, stepping closer. "I found you outside. You looked, well, you needed help." He tried to sit up, wincing in pain. "I shouldn't be here," he muttered. "Do you remember what happened to you?" Lily asked, her voice gentle but firm. The man's eyes darted around the room, as if searching for something unseen. "It doesn't matter," he said finally, his tone evasive. Lily frowned but didn't press him further. She could see the fear in his eyes, the kind of fear that told her he was running from something far bigger than he wanted to admit. Over the next few days, Lily found herself torn between wanting answers and respecting his silence. Each time she tried to ask about his past, he would deflect with vague responses. "Why don't you trust me?" she asked one evening as she handed him a bowl of soup. "It's not about trust," he replied, staring into the bowl. "It's about keeping you safe." His words, though cryptic, sent a chill down her spine. Yet she couldn't bring herself to turn him away. There was something in his demeanor, a heaviness that mirrored her own struggles in a way she couldn't quite explain. One evening, as they sat in the dim light of the small room, Lily shared her own story. She spoke of her mother's illness, her siblings' needs, and the dreams she had buried beneath her responsibilities. "I wanted to be a teacher," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But now I just want to make sure my family has enough to eat." The stranger listened intently, his gaze softening. "You're stronger than most people I've known," he said after a long pause. "Stronger than I've ever been." Lily blinked, surprised by his words. "You don't know me," she said quietly. "Sometimes you don't need to know someone long to see their strength," he replied. As the days passed, Lily began noticing small hints about the stranger's past. His posture, though weary, carried an air of authority. The way he spoke, measured and deliberate, hinted at an education far beyond what anyone in their neighborhood could afford. One night, as he muttered in his sleep, she caught fragments of a name she didn't recognize and words like documents and betrayal. Whatever he was running from, it was clear it wasn't ordinary. Lily sat by the window, staring out at the quiet street. She couldn't shake the feeling that his presence in her life wasn't an accident. For the first time in a long while, she felt as though her actions, her choices, might ripple into something bigger than herself. The room was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint rustle of fabric as the stranger shifted uneasily on the makeshift bed. Lily sat at the edge of the room, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, watching him cautiously. His face was a mixture of weariness and determination, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, fear. "Who are you?" she asked softly, her voice barely louder than a whisper. The man hesitated, his gaze fixed on the cracked ceiling. "It's better if you don't know," he finally replied, his tone sharp but tired. Lily frowned but didn't push further. His answer wasn't just evasive, it was calculated, as though revealing the truth would unravel something far greater than either of them. "You're running from something," she ventured, her voice steady but laced with concern. He flinched, a barely perceptible movement, but enough for Lily to notice. "Running? Maybe. Surviving? Definitely," he murmured, his words trailing off as though he was speaking more to himself than to her. Later that evening, Lily lit a small candle and set it on the windowsill, its faint glow casting long shadows across the room. The stranger sat up suddenly, his body tense. "Blow it out," he said quickly, his voice urgent. "What?" "The light. It's too visible," he insisted, his eyes darting toward the window. Lily hesitated but complied, extinguishing the candle. "You're scared of being seen," she observed, her heart sinking at the realization. "It's not just about me," he said quietly, his shoulders slumping. "Anyone near me is in danger." Her stomach tightened. She glanced toward the curtain that separated the room from her sleeping family. The implications of his words hit her like a wave. This wasn't just about helping a stranger anymore. It was about risking the only thing she had left, her family. As the moon climbed higher into the sky, Lily sat by the window, her thoughts a swirling storm. The stranger's warning replayed in her mind. She had made her choice when she brought him here, but now the weight of that decision pressed heavily on her chest. "You can't stay in the house," she said abruptly, breaking the silence. The stranger looked at her, his expression unreadable. "There's a shed out back," she continued, avoiding his gaze. "It's not much, but it's safer for everyone." For a moment, he didn't respond. Then he nodded. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone sincere. The next morning, Lily's younger brother Sam stood by the window, watching the shed where the stranger now stayed. "Who is he?" Sam asked, his voice tinged with curiosity and fear. "I don't know," Lily admitted, rushing past him to gather her things for work. Their mother, sitting weakly on the old couch, sighed heavily. "Lily, we can't afford to invite trouble. We're barely holding on as it is." "I know, Mama," Lily replied, her voice quiet but firm. "But I couldn't just leave him there. He needed help." Her mother didn't argue further, but the unease in her eyes spoke volumes. By midday, whispers had already begun to spread through the neighborhood. As Lily walked to the market, she could feel the stares and hear the hushed voices. "Did you hear about Lily? She brought some man into her home. Who knows what kind of trouble he's in? She's always been too kind for her own good." Lily kept her head high, but each word felt like a stone being thrown at her. She clenched her fists, refusing to let their gossip shake her resolve. That evening, as she brought the stranger a plate of food, she noticed something different about him. Despite his disheveled appearance, his movements were deliberate, almost elegant. "You weren't always like this," she said, her tone curious. He looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "The way you carry yourself, the way you speak, it doesn't match." She trailed off, gesturing vaguely at his current state. He let out a low chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "Life has a way of stripping you down to nothing," he said, taking the plate from her hands. His words lingered in the air long after she left the shed. Over the next few days, Lily noticed small changes in the stranger. He began helping her with small tasks, from fixing the broken latch on the shed door to mending an old chair that had been wobbly for years. "Why are you doing this?" she asked one evening, watching him repair a torn blanket. "Because I owe you," he said simply, not looking up. "You don't owe me anything," she replied. He paused, his hands stilling. "Maybe not," he admitted, but it's the least I can do. One night, as the house slept, Lily sat by the window again, her thoughts heavy. She glanced toward the shed, where the faint glow of a candle flickered through the cracks. The stranger's shadow moved within, his figure tall and steady despite everything. She couldn't shake the feeling that his presence in her life was no accident. There was something about him, something hidden yet significant. For the first time in days, she allowed herself a small smile. Whatever lay ahead, she had made her choice. The flicker of a small candle in the shed cast faint shadows on the stranger's face as he sat, staring at his weathered hands. Lily stood a few steps away, her arms crossed as she leaned against the doorway. The silence stretched between them until she finally broke it. "You don't have to tell me everything," she said softly, "but I deserve to know something." The man glanced up, his eyes meeting hers. There was a quiet storm in them, a mixture of regret and defiance. "Once I had everything, and now I have nothing," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily took a step closer, her curiosity piqued. "What happened?" For the first time, the man hesitated before answering. "I was the head of a company, a big one. Decisions, deals, power, they were all mine." He let out a bitter laugh. "I thought I was untouchable, but the people I trusted, my friends, my business partners, they saw my success as an opportunity. They tore me down when I wasn't looking." As the days passed, he began to open up more. Sitting on the floor of the shed, he described how his closest allies had turned against him. "They built a web of lies around me," he said one evening, staring into the distance. "Forged documents, fake accusations. By the time I realized what was happening, they had stripped me of everything. My position, my money, my reputation, all gone." Lily sat on an old crate, listening intently. "Why didn't you fight back?" she asked. "I tried," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "But they were smarter. They knew every move I'd make. And when I had nothing left to give, they left me to be hunted by the very system I had once controlled." The stark differences between their lives became painfully evident as he shared more about his past. "I lived in a house so big, I sometimes forgot how many rooms it had," he said, shaking his head. Lily smiled faintly. "We have one room for everything. No chance of forgetting." He looked at her, his expression softening. "And yet you seem more at peace than I ever was." "I don't know about peace," she admitted. "But I've learned to be thankful for what little we have. It keeps me going." Her words lingered in his mind long after their conversation ended. One night, as they sat outside under the stars, Lily spoke about her own struggles. "I wanted to be a teacher," she said, her voice filled with longing. "I thought maybe, just maybe, I could make a difference in someone's life. But dreams don't pay the bills, and they definitely don't keep my siblings fed." The man listened intently, his gaze never leaving her face. "You're stronger than you know," he said quietly. She looked at him, her brow furrowed. "I don't feel strong. Most days, I feel like I'm barely holding on." "Strength isn't about how you feel," he replied. "It's about what you do, even when you feel like giving up." As their conversations deepened, they began to see the parallels in their struggles. Lily, fighting to keep her family afloat, and the man, grappling with the wreckage of his once powerful life. "You had the world," Lily said one day, "and I've never even seen beyond this town. But it seems like we both ended up here, in this tiny shed, trying to figure out what to do next." He smiled faintly. "Maybe that's the point. Doesn't matter where you start or what you have. Life has a way of humbling everyone." Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. The stranger began to help Lily in small ways, fixing broken furniture and mending old clothes. She found herself smiling more, despite the tension that still lingered in the air. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said one day as they worked side by side. "Who?" "Me," he replied simply, "before I lost my way." But the peace they had found was short-lived. Late one night, as Lily prepared to sleep, she noticed the faint glow of headlights passing by the shed. Her heart raced as she peeked through the curtain. "Something's not right," she murmured, slipping out the door and heading toward the shed. The man was already on high alert, his face pale in the dim light. "They're looking for me," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Who?" He didn't answer, instead moving quickly to extinguish the candle. "You need to stay inside," he said firmly. "If they come here—" "They won't," she interrupted, her voice trembling but resolute. "They can't." The tension between safety and morality grew heavier with each passing moment. Lily's mother and siblings begged her to send the stranger away. "He's bringing trouble to our door," her mother said, her voice shaking. "We can't handle this, Lily. We just can't." But Lily couldn't bring herself to abandon him. "If we don't help him, who will?" she argued, tears streaming down her face. Her mother's silence was deafening. One evening, as the stranger sat alone in the shed, Lily joined him, carrying a small plate of bread. "I should leave," he said quietly. "No," she replied firmly. "You're here for a reason. We'll figure this out." Her words gave him a glimmer of hope he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he began to believe that redemption was possible. The stranger spent the next few days devising a plan to confront those who had wronged him. "I can't keep running," he said one morning as they sat outside. "If I don't face them, this will never end." "And what if you fail?" Lily asked, her voice heavy with worry. He looked at her, his expression steady. "Then at least I'll know I tried." His resolve inspired her. Together, they prepared for what lay ahead, their bond stronger than ever. The house was silent except for the soft creak of the wooden floor beneath Lily's bare feet. She had been restless, unable to sleep, when she heard the faint murmur of a voice drifting through the open window. The sound drew her closer to the shed, where a soft light glowed through the cracks. Inside, the stranger paced back and forth, clutching the small, worn phone. His voice was low, tense. "You don't understand," he said sharply. "If this falls into the wrong hands, we're all done. Everyone will be exposed." Lily froze, her breath catching in her throat. She pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear more. A pause. The voice on the other end was muffled, but its tone was equally urgent. "Yes, I still have it," the stranger said, his voice softened, almost trembling. "But I can't keep running. It's time to end this." Lily's heart pounded. What was he talking about? What did he still have? When the conversation ended, the stranger slumped onto the edge of the cot, his head in his hands. Lily stepped hesitantly into the shed. "I heard you," she said quietly. The man's head shot up, his face a mixture of surprise and resignation. "I figured you might." "You're not just running, are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You're carrying something important." He nodded slowly. "It's evidence. Enough to take down people who think they're untouchable." His eyes met hers, filled with both weariness and defiance. "But it's also a death sentence if it falls into the wrong hands." The candle flickered as they sat across from each other, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. "I didn't trust you at first," he admitted, his voice soft. "I didn't trust anyone. People, they disappoint you. They take advantage. I had to know if someone like you still existed, someone who'd help, even with nothing to gain." Lily stared at him, stunned. You were testing me?" "Yes," he said simply. "And you proved me wrong. You showed me that there's still hope, that maybe this fight is worth it after all." Her chest tightened. She wanted to feel angry, betrayed even, but instead she felt a deep sadness for the man before her. The stranger leaned forward, his voice urgent now. "I have a plan, but it's risky, dangerous, and I need your help." Lily's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of help?" He pulled a small, battered envelope from his coat pocket. "This," he said, placing it on the table between them. "Inside is everything, names, accounts, proof of their crimes. It has to get to someone I trust, someone who can do something with it." "Why can't you take it yourself?" she asked. "I can't move freely anymore. They're watching me. If I make one wrong step, it's over." He paused, his voice faltering. "But they won't be looking for you." Lily's mind raced. The enormity of what he was asking wasn't lost on her. She thought of her family, her mother's fragile health, her siblings' dependence on her. Could she really risk it all for a man she barely knew? "I won't force you," he said quietly. "This is your choice." Lily stared at the envelope for what felt like an eternity before finally nodding. "I'll do it." Relief washed over the stranger's face, but it was quickly replaced by determination. "We'll have to be careful. No one can know. If they suspect you." "They won't," she interrupted, her voice steadier than she felt. Together, they laid out a plan. The trusted ally was in a neighboring town, reachable by bus if she left early enough. She would carry the envelope in an old, inconspicuous bag, blending in as just another traveler. "You'll need to be alert," the stranger warned. "If you see anyone following you, don't lead them to him. Get rid of the envelope first. Burn it if you have to." Lily nodded, her throat tight. She didn't want to think about what might happen if things went wrong. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight found Lily standing at the edge of the road, her small bag slung over her shoulder. The stranger stood a few paces behind her, his face unreadable. "You don't have to do this," he said one last time. "I know," she replied, her voice firm, "but I'm doing it anyway." He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you for everything." Lily gave a small, hesitant smile before turning and boarding the bus. The journey was tense. Lily kept her eyes on the road ahead, but her senses were heightened, scanning every face, every movement. The bus stopped twice to let passengers off, and each time, she felt a flicker of fear that someone might be watching her. When she finally arrived in the neighboring town, her heart was racing. She clutched the bag tightly as she navigated the unfamiliar streets, the stranger's instructions replaying in her mind. Reaching the alley's location, Lily hesitated outside the modest house. She glanced over her shoulder, her paranoia now a constant hum in the back of her mind. Satisfied that no one had followed her, she knocked on the door. A man in his 40s answered, his expression cautious. "You must be Lily," he said. She nodded, handing him the envelope. This is from him." The man took it, his grip firm. "You've done something incredible today. Thank you." Lily didn't linger. She turned and walked away quickly, her heart still pounding. As she boarded the bus back home, Lily allowed herself a small breath of relief. The envelope was no longer in her hands, but the weight of what it represented still pressed heavily on her. Back at the shed, the stranger waited, pacing nervously. When she arrived, he stopped and looked at her expectantly. "It's done," she said simply. His shoulders sagged with relief, and for the first time, a genuine smile spread across his face. "You've done more than you know," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. Lily smiled faintly, exhaustion washing over her. Whatever came next, she had taken the leap, and somehow she knew it would matter. The courtroom was silent as the stranger stood before the gathered audience, the weight of his evidence laid bare for all to see. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering the proof he needed to expose the corruption that had destroyed his life. The once powerful men who had betrayed him now sat in the front row, their faces pale with fear and denial. "This," the stranger said, holding up a stack of papers, "is the truth they tried to bury. It's the truth they didn't want anyone to see." The crowd murmured as the documents were passed to the judge. One by one, the lies unraveled. Bank accounts, forged signatures, and secret deals painted a damning picture. For the first time in years, the stranger felt a flicker of hope. Justice wasn't a word he had believed in for a long time, but today it felt real. When the verdict was announced, the courtroom erupted into applause. The stranger, once a man hunted and broken, stood tall as he reclaimed not only his reputation, but his dignity. That evening, as the city lights twinkled outside the window, the stranger sat across from Lily in her small, cozy home. "They offered me my old position back," he said, his voice calm but thoughtful. "And?" Lily asked, raising an eyebrow. He shook his head. "It's not who I am anymore. Power, money, it all seems so hollow now. I've seen what happens when those things become everything. I want a life that means more than just numbers and deals." Lily smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "So, what's next?" He leaned back, a rare smile crossing his face. "I think I'll start over. Help others the way you helped me. It's the least I can do." A week later, Lily stood outside her home, holding an envelope the stranger had left behind. Inside was a handwritten note and a check that made her knees weak. "Lily," the note began, "your kindness changed my life. This is a small way of saying thank you. Use to chase your dreams, the ones you thought you'd left behind. Tears blurred her vision as she read the words. The amount on the check was more money than she had ever seen in her life, enough to pay off their debts, cover her siblings' school fees, and even allow her to return to school. Her mother, standing beside her, gasped when she saw the check. "Lily, is this real?" "It is," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "It's real." The changes in their lives came swiftly. The crumbling walls of their home were repaired, the leaks in the roof patched up. Lily's siblings, once dressed in threadbare clothes, now had warm coats for the winter. Her mother, finally able to see a doctor, regained a bit of the strength she had lost over the years. For the first time, their home was filled with laughter and hope. The weight that had pressed on Lily's shoulders for so long began to lift, replaced by a sense of possibility she hadn't felt since she was a child. One evening, as Lily walked through the neighborhood, she passed the old corner store where she had so often stood, dreaming of a life beyond the broken streets. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the stranger who had stumbled into her life and changed it forever. She paused, looking up at the stars. "I don't know where you are now," she murmured, "but I hope you know what you've done for us." Her words hung in the air, carried away by the wind. In the days that followed, Lily often found herself reflecting on the power of that one decision, to help someone when it would have been easier to walk away. She thought about how much that simple act of compassion had changed not only the stranger's life but her own. Her belief in kindness, once a quiet conviction, was now unshakable. She had seen its ripple effect firsthand, how one small act could ignite a chain of events that transformed everything. As the story drew to its close, the scene shifted to a larger, unseen world. Somewhere, another person paused to consider helping a stranger. Somewhere else, a small act of generosity set off a ripple of change. The narrator's voice, warm and steady, carried the message. In a world that often feels divided,